to his immediate right is Don Herron. If you ever get to San Francisco, I highly recommend you go on Don's hammock tour. And Brian Leno, who has written a good deal about Howard for The Cimmerian, and Bill Cavalier, editor of Rahupa. So they're going to tell us all about Howard's creation of Conan and the birth of the sword and sorcery genre. Big hand for them.
Try to make this, I think we'll try to make this quick because we certainly don't want to get between you people in the auction.
We're no fools.
We may be Conan fans, but we're not Conan. So yeah, this is the 80th anniversary of Conan in 1932. In March of 1932, the first of the world outside of Robert E. Howard's skull knew about Conan was a letter to H.P. Lovecraft, in which he said he created a new character and had created a whole world, the Hyborian Age, for this character. And he had submitted just about that time 3 stories to Farnsworth Wright. He submitted The Phoenix on the Sword, which is a rewrite of a Cull story by the Sex Out of Louisville. He had submitted The Frost Giant's Daughter, and then very shortly after that, he spent those 2 together, and then very shortly after that, The God in the Ball. Of course, only The Phoenix on the Sword was accepted at that time, and it ended up being the first Conan story published in December 1932. So, prior to Conan, there had been a lot of heroes, even barbarian heroes, in fiction and in pulps. Of course, the most famous being Tarzan, who's 20 years older than Conan. So the question that I'm going to start these guys with is, why the heck did Conan take off?
For me, the reason Conan took off is because I think Edgar Rice Burroughs made the mistake of marrying Tarzan off in the second book, so consequently Tarzan couldn't do anything. Conan was the ultimate individualist hero. He could go wherever he wanted. He could drink as much as he wanted. He could kill as many people as he wanted, and that was very appealing.
Yeah. There's the other thing with Conan as the hero and Sword and Sorcery. We've actually spent a lot of our prospective panel time sitting at the bar talking about various things. And it's kind of how you do it, right? And the premise is there before Howard with Conan solidified the genre of sword and sorcery. And Howard, you guys are Pulp readers, most of you, I'm sure. You know the arena really well. And Howard, at the time he killed himself, when he was 30 in 1936, he was poised to become a major contributor to Pulps. He cracked into Argosy. Jack Byrne, who had been his editor at Action Stories, was now the new editor of Argosy. He was just going to buy story after story for him. And Howard could have become another H. Bedford Jones or whomever, but that's not why we like Howard. We like Howard because of his weird hybridizations of things. Like, for example, one of the things he's famous for now is he's one of the early proponents of the weird Western story, where it's vampires and cowboys. And in Sword and Sorcery, this huge mashup of other stuff. The elements of fantasy, horror, whatever. And he's the first guy who did it. Generally speaking, his Cull story, The Shadow Kingdom, is considered the first Sword and Sorcery story. But that still feels like a fantasy, whereas the Conan stories actually have that raw pulp energy to them, like the Black Mask writers were having. It was something of that era, and I think that's why they really jumped up, because for the first time he's doing something equivalent to what's going on, you know, in the pulp pages of these other magazines. It's not like the older stuff. It's new. It's very 20th century.
Howard wrap everything up that you read earlier, like if you read Fu Manchu, we could make it into Skullface, and he'd take him back thousands of years. Frost Giant's Daughter, he could take a story like from Ghost Stories by Helen Forsythe, shooting it for Linda Klein. And he wrote about a modern day woman in the snow called Sweetheart of the Snows. And he could take that basic premise and he could make it into the Frost Giant's Daughter. And anything, it seemed like anything he could touch, he improved upon. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy reading Howard, because, you know, Fu Manchu, I think it's a little dated, but Skullface, he still does it.
I think Howard was a great amalgamator. He could take, with the Conan stories, he took weapons from a certain area, an era, like Jim was talking about. He amalgamated them, you know, the bootleggers and the town bullies and the, you know, the con men and all that, amalgamated that into Conan.
I've done a lot of, I've written about this a number of times, that G.K. Chesterton had written about the idea of telescoping history, mix history and legend and all, and put it together. And Howard really did that with the Ivorian Age. He loved writing historicals. That was his favorite thing to do. But what he complained about was it takes too darn long to research them and to write it, and you have to pay attention to whether the facts are right. In the Ivorian Age, you could say, I can take all of human history and I can mash it together, and I can have Elizabethan pirates fighting against Barbary corsairs with Cossacks sweeping across the steppes, and they can all be in the same story because it's just made up. But it's a wonderful playground for a guy who loves history and has that historical feel. We call it fantasy, but they really have a historical feel to them.
They were mentioning on the Conan art panel, Greg Manchess in his books, they showed the pirate with the fancy silk and whatever, and said, I don't know, it's kind of weird, you know, it's kind of not like Conan. And I was actually in Cross Plains here when Manchess was the guest of honor and the speaker, and he was saying, as they were saying, he didn't know what he was before. He's just reading it for the first time, and he's reading along, and he's not getting it. He's not getting it until, I guess, the Black Stranger. He was reading the Black Stranger, and they have all this pirate stuff going on. He says, "Oh, wait a second, this guy, Conan's a pirate. He's just—it's that simple. He's a pirate, or he's whatever he is." And he takes that, and Howard's talent, you know, he springs it to the point where now he's getting to become a standard. Unlike, unfortunately, a lot of the pulp writers who were really big in their day and are fading away because they don't have whatever that sense of currency is, or immortality.
And Howard's stories are linked really well, you know, when you start reading them, like Brand McMorn is a relative of Brule, the Spear Slayer from Cull. In the first Conan story, you Thoth Amon. Later on, he's mentioned in The Hour of the Dragon. It's, you know, there's running characters throughout the series. Then even in the modern times, in The Haunter of the Ring, someone gets a hold of a ring that was owned by Thoth Amon. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't just a slipshod world that he hurriedly put together.
The brilliant Howard critic Steve Tompkins was, just before his death, was pointing out to me, we were plotting a book actually, that he was pointing out to me that everybody talks about what a wonderful world builder Tolkien was and how all that detail he put into the background and everything. And he said, Howard did that. All of Robert E. Howard's work is interrelated. There are references throughout to some other story, some other era, whatever. It's all related. And so he was doing this incredibly complex, eon-spanning history of the world and time. Conan was only part of that, but he put the Ivorian Age in there between sort of prehistory and our modern history of the British.
And one of the things when I started buying the Lancer paperbacks with great Frazetta covers in the 60s, and started getting more of this. But I remember the attitude about Conan at the time, which is repeated kind of by Lynn Carter and Nels Craig DeCamp and various things they would write or say, was that Howard, yeah, he was this protean talent, but he just wasn't good enough to make it into the best pulps. We've probably all been around, mostly been around long enough to have heard that, remember that thing being said at the time. That's why I always like to point out to people that just as at the time of his death, he had 5 stories appearing in Argosy. He cracked Argosy. Argosy was one of the prestige pulps. Another one, Adventure. He hopped in Price, and I knew he'd hop in Price, and he'd always say, yeah, Howard, we never cracked Adventure. It wasn't easy to crack Adventure. And then, of course, there's Blue Book, which you've seen some covers of. And Ed Price, he never cracked Blue Book. But Glenn Lord, who, of course, was the main Howard guy for, probably forever, in his lifetime, certainly for years, left a bunch of boxes of stuff, and they've been going through it. And so we got the idea, you couldn't crack Argosy. Okay, that's nonsense. You did crack Argosy. And now, Rusty's was mentioning something about the idea he, would he have made Adventure or not?
Well, he was this close. Actually, Earl Bloomfield had expressed interest in and was on the verge of accepting Howard's story, Fist of the Desert, a boxing story, but it's really about a guy who's a washed-up boxer, and then an agent comes and finds him and tries to get him back in the game. It's one of his more serious boxing stories. And Howard had, of course, been trying to crack Adventure, and in this case, I don't know that it was Adventure. He never mentions Adventure, but he's talking about Bloomfield buying this for the popular magazines, and he really wanted to crack that market. And he's going to try to do it with some sports stuff. So this is early 1936. He's right on the cusp of making this market that he's always been after. But of course, that's right when his mother goes into decline. The house is always full of people. He has no privacy to write, and so things start spiraling downhill.
Yeah, he killed himself on, what is it, June 11th, and and he'd been trying to crack Adventure, I guess, since he was 15.
Yeah.
So for 15 entire years, he was trying to crack Adventure.
First magazine he's been to.
Yeah. So he kept that. He's very resilient, I think, in his markets. What, how much time do we got? We don't want to.
20 minutes.
Should we do questions now?
You talk about Howard having currency and having qualities that make him more or less timeless. I'm not trying to be deliberately provocative, but I pose this as a serious question. Do you think it's just as possibly say that some of the other pulp writers of skill are not remembered where Howard is? Is it possible, do you think, that if Harold Lamb's stories had been reprinted with Frank Frazetta covers and marketed the way that the Lancer paperbacks would, that maybe he or some of the other adventure-type writers might have enjoyed the same kind of revival and engendered the same kind of fandom that Howard has?
Speaking as a guy who really loves Harold Lamb, I just don't think he has the energy in his stuff. One of the things that I think Howard does, and we talk about this a lot, is he compresses. Everything is really pushed. It's just down to the nub. And I think that's part of what gives it its energy, and it's absolutely perfect for the attention deficit.
No offense to the attention deficit age.
And also, Howard had Conan, and that was a big, the big thing for Howard.
Yeah, and the thing with I've written this in various places, but the Frazetta covers, which are great. Larry Shaw, who's the editor at Lancer, is the one who hired Frazetta, having seen the Frazetta covers for the Burroughs and from Ace Books, and he's the one who hired him to do it. And the books came out, and it's like one of the few cases I think Carl Everett Wagner's Kane series later on with mostly prosthetic covers is another example. But it's one of the few cases where you have a cover where the contents of the book, at least the contents written by Howard, are as good as the cover. At their best. There are a few weaker Conan stories, sure. But, at the top level that, you go beyond the Black River, Red Nail, something like that. These stories are as good as the prosthetic covers. And there were tons of prosthetic, you guys all know this, tons of prosthetic covers on all kinds of books. And I was running around buying them. I was buying the Captain Future, Edmund Hamilton with kind of the weird round, spaceship on the cover, and the Mastodon, and the Guy in the Arena, and all these other covers. And those books didn't pop, not as big as Conan. So I think that's the answer. And you could give, like some people will give credit to L. Sprague de Camp. And it's a good idea for the series. Their problem was they added their stuff into it, which just isn't as good, and the series still succeeds, despite all that stuff. You're just, as a teenager, you're reading them, or in my case, and you're going, oh, wait a second, this stuff's really good, and this stuff sucks. Oh, okay, let me start figuring out what I should read and what I should start skipping.
Can you comment on the influence on Howard of Carol John Daly and Dashiell Hammett and
Black
Mystery
Mask?
Revolution, and also how self-aware that Howard was, that he was creating such sort of sorcery genre?
Well, let's take them in two parts, okay? I'll do that. I wrote the essay under the name George Knight on the Howard as a hard-boiled writer of that era. And Morgan Holmes, by the way, who apologizes for not being there. He was supposed to be on the panel way back when. We looked into, there's no reference whatsoever to Howard ever reading Black Mask. None. Why not? And Morgan's developed a weird idea that maybe it wasn't because of the distribution system. Maybe it wasn't distributed in Cross Plains, Texas, or in that general area. And I don't know. And I think even if he never read Carol John Daly and never read Hammett or Black Mask in any, maybe he read an issue or something, but he never talked about it. He's writing in that same era. So it's kind of like the zeitgeist. It's something that's happening at that moment. And he's one of the people who could go with it, who picked it up. But instead of applying it to writing fantasy stories, to the detective stories, he's writing fantasy because that's what he's writing. And Sword Sorcery, and you think he knew what he was doing.
So I think he knew he was creating.
Yeah, like a genre, you mean? Specific genre?
Do you think he was aware that he was doing for fantasy what the Black Mask writers did for mystery?
I would say no. I would say he was just doing it naturally. And there's, I think, as opposed to Hammett knew what he was doing. There's enough references and so forth. He says, I want to take the mystery story, make literature out of it, and so forth. Chandler, of course, who comes after Hammett by a decade, obviously knew what he was doing, very intellectual about it. Howard, as far as I can tell, is just this roller coaster of a writer.
Yeah, Howard may have been cursed by a photographic memory. And as he read everything, he remembered everything. And some of that would seep into his work.
I don't think he was a self-conscious stylist. He knew what he wanted to do in terms of telling a story. But I don't think he had some self-conscious program of, I'm going to do this.
Which, by the way, there's a question right there. Before that, it might seem like Rusty just contradicted himself, because he's talking about the whole elaborate tie-in of everything versus what he just said. I think you can do both. I don't think they're contradictory.
Well, that's stylist.
Yeah. It's like having this overarching kind of name. Oh, yeah, I'll do this and I'll do this. Versus, oh yeah, I'm going to toughen up the fantasy story. The fantasy story needs toughening up. he naturally gravitated to the tough guy style.
So you mentioned that he was trying to track adventure in his life. But do we know if he was still working on Conan before he committed suicide, or was he planning on more stories?
He was done. In my opinion, we've been talking about that this weekend.
We've been arguing about it.
In my opinion, Red Nails, the end of Red Nails, he was done. Conan was going off in a fanfare of trumpets into the sunset, and it was over. And he did that with his characters. He moved on.
Yeah, he finished Red Nails in 1935, so, and he died the next year. So.
Yeah, and the reason it was appearing in Weird Tales at the time of his death, in installments. And they've been holding it because Farnsworth Wright owed him roughly $800, $1,000, and back money he owed him for the stories. So he wasn't sending for that entire year we're talking about when Red Nails went in. He wasn't sending Weird Tales to write more fiction. And my personal idea, and I actually was an organizer called Conan the Argonaut about this, I think he would have taken, or could have taken, Conan to Argosy with him, because Jack Byrne, who asked him to come with him to write stories for Argosy, would have taken it. And Morgan actually dug up a letter. So Howard dies June of 1936. I think this letter was around May of 1936, where Otto Binder, body robot went down to Byrne's offices and asked him kind of what he wanted. Byrne was saying, yeah, I'd really like a fantasy. I'd really like a 30,000-word fantasy. Where could he have gotten that, right? In a couple of months, Howard had killed himself. So I think it's quite possible. And the other two kind of major things, among many others, P. Schuyler Miller and John D. Clark wrote to him. He did that, sent them the maps. He told them all these plans he had for Conan. And you remember the name of the guy who Howard wrote in the letter, Robert Clark, something like that. In Weird Tales, he wrote about getting a letter from Howard, and he said, Howard told him, yeah, he's going to take Conan off on all these adventures he mentioned, all these various things he would do. The actual letter from Howard's never turned up, but the letters, the guy's letter attributed Howard to the Weird Tales.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so he's telling some of his fans, and the thing is, these fans are now coming into it, right then. Like, it's kind of building that way kind of thing. And you have guys like Fritz Leiber starting to write. Other people could have mentioned, yeah, you done that.
As soon as Robert Hart committed suicide and there wasn't any more Conan, some of the fans were writing in saying they wanted someone to replace Conan. So I think he still would have written him if Farnsworth Wright ever would have had the decency to pay him.
Yeah, for Weird Tales or for someone else. I think Wright kind of burned his bridges with Howard probably, but it's hard to say. But yeah, every quote about Wright from Howard at the end is pretty negative. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
I've been reading Collected Letters, which is just a marvelous set of books. I was struck by how widely read Howard was, and all these obscure books that you just think, he mentions, I read so-and-so in a letter to Lovecraft or somebody else, and I think, how did he get all these books? Was the library in Cross Plains, it's like, we've got a cosmic portal.
Cross Plains didn't even have a library. To go to a library, you had to go to Brownwood. They had a Carnegie library there, but there was a wonderful bookstore in Waco that he went to quite a bit, and he mail ordered from the Argosy bookstore in New York and probably many others. He was absolutely insatiable when it came to books, but he had to get them through the mail and through going to other towns.
His library was about 300 books.
Over 300 books.
If you look at some of the old Ring magazines, there's ads in there all over the place where you can buy boxing books by Nat Fletcher. And a lot of those were in his library, or he references the fighters, so you could buy them through the mail.
There's also, I think there's an element to this where we develop certain ideas about different writers at certain times. So you get this idea, Howard, he was a hick living in the middle of Texas. He couldn't possibly have blah, blah, and blah, right? who in fact, you know, he did it. Same thing with Hammett. When Chandler wrote the essay, The Simple Art of Murder, you know, defending the hard-boiled detective story, he's treating Hammett, the way he's regarding him, as some kind of Grandma Moses primitive figure. It's like, yeah, you know, he dropped out of school when he's 14, then he was a detective, and then he became a writer, and somehow he just naturally was good at it, you know, like Grandma Moses, you know, with her paintings. And now the more stuff you know about Hammett, you know, he's another one of these omnivorous readers who read and influenced by everything. Yeah, I think that's probably a lot truer than most of these people than we typically would think.
De Camp, what's your thoughts on him, I don't know, diagnosing Howard as the moment boy?
We don't know that. But I don't think nobody up here is going to.
Yeah, but that's still passed around as gospel truth.
Oh yeah, again, in certain circles, certain mindsets, you get these things, they get developed, or they become entrenched out there, and then you have.
I mean, how many years is it since Edgar Allan Poe died, and people still think he was a drunkard? It's not true, but everybody knows that. Well, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
We've done what we can to kind of get out there, but there might be other ways of looking at this. But
yeah, and I think Howard's suicide is much more complicated. Just his mother died and he killed himself. It's like obviously he had a history of depression. There's the thing I mentioned about Wright owing him $1,000. 1936, $1,000 was a pretty good annual income for any average person. And Howard obviously was on this roll with Conan, with Beyond the Black, the Red Nails. Maybe, unlike wrestling, maybe he wanted to write more, maybe he's on that, but he's not being paid. So he's got something he wants to do, but he can't do it, so he converts himself. So there's just tons of collateral reasons underlying that. Yeah. Oh, wait a second. I developed a line for this. This is Ed Chapstick, as we call him. And Ed is going to walk into the kitchen now and break some eggs. Right, Ed? Come on.
Actually, probably a question that everybody asks is, we had Tarzan yesterday, talking about Tarzan. Now we're talking about Conan. Two iconic characters that have really gotten a bad shape in Hollywood and in the memories of a lot of people. I mean, Tarzan in the movies is so different than Tarzan in the books. I throw James Bond out there. James Bond is so different in the books than in the movies. Conan the same way. I guess my question is, where do you guys foresee Conan going, 10 years from now? Do you think the perception of people will change, or will it be the same thing as Tarzan? Just some, healing in Africa, swinging through the line.
I think it's already starting as far as all the Conan stories are out there, as Howard wrote them. They're available for everybody to read. The second Howard boom, as I like to call it, it's coming to a close. The foundation, REH Foundation, is publishing a lot of Howard's other works, but I lost my train of thought.
Speaking of the ADD generation.
He's basically saying almost everything that can be in print is coming into print.
Yeah,
and a lot of it is.
As he wrote it.
I got it back. Well,
is that enough to change?
Perception is changing because now academia is discovering Robert E. Howard, and they're going to give him a big boost.
I personally have my doubts on that. But but kind of an answer to your question, what you're really asking is, do we think there'll ever be a really good Howardian Conan movie? Probably not, but if there were, that would really help change. It's kind of like with Tarzan, when they did Greystoke and various other things. There were certain, nudges away from the me Tarzan, you Jane kind of concepts. No.
one of the things that happened, one of the things that Howard did a lot, you'll notice, is if you read the first story of any character or series or whatever, he took something he'd already done as a springboard to that. And one that just jumps into my memory, of course, is that the first Breckenridge Elkins funny Western story involves a boxing match. He'd already done a lot of boxing stories. He knew how to write that. So the first Conan story is a Cole story. He takes what he's already done and uses it as a springboard into something else, and sometimes it clicks, and he does like a weird Western. So when he starts thinking, I want to write Westerns, what does he do? He knows how to write weird stories. So he writes the Horror from the Mound, and Holy Horror Feels Heart, and those kind of things. And then he kind of segues into straight Western. So there was probably this, a little bit of a sense that I'm creating something new, but it was more like I'm trying to get into this new field, and I want to do it in a way that makes me comfortable. But it was a natural melding of time.
I agree with it's very organic in that he's trying to overlay his Iron Man ideas on all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
We got an auction,
Sorry,
folks.
we got